It began with silence. Not the kind of silence that comforts, the kind that watches. Stockholm, winter of 1943. The air was thin, the streets brittle with frost, and the city, draped in neutrality, seemed to hold its breath. Beneath the calm, invisible tides of information moved faster than trains, heavier than armies. A war of words, numbers, and whispers was being fought in rooms without flags, by men without uniforms. In a dim apartment overlooking the harbor, an American officer stared at a map dotted with pins and notes. He was not a soldier. He carried no weapon. His battlefield was paper and his victories measured in secrets. The man's name was Alan Dulles. He had arrived in Switzerland under diplomatic cover, officially to represent the United States, unofficially to wage an invisible war against Nazi Germany from the heart of neutrality. Across Europe, bombs fell, empires cracked, and millions vanished into the machinery of destruction. But here in cities like Zurich and Stockholm, another front existed, colder, quieter, and arguably more decisive. Here the fight was for knowledge, for blueprints, for formulas, for the pulse of a nation that turned science into slaughter. The men and women of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, came not to destroy but to listen. And in that listening to shape the outcome of the war. They called it information gathering, but the word barely hinted at the magnitude of what they were chasing. From these neutral capitals, the OSS pieced together the story of Germany's secret weapons. The rockets, the submarines, the air defenses, and something even darker, the shadow of chemical and biological warfare. Every cable sent, every meeting arranged, every rumor dissected was a move in a chess game played against an empire that preferred silence to confession. Alan Dulles was a lawyer by training, but in Switzerland he became something else, a curator of human secrets. His network stretched from the embassies of neutral diplomats to the trembling hands of German defectors. He met priests and businessmen, spies and double agents, all bound by fear and necessity. Some came for money. Some came for redemption. And some came because they could no longer bear the weight of what they knew. Dulles listened to them all, his quiet patience concealing the scale of what he was building, an empire of knowledge beneath a world at war. But every whisper came at a cost. In the war of intelligence, truth was never pure. Every fact was a half-truth, every ally a potential enemy. How much of what they learned was real? How much was manipulation? How many lives hung in the balance of a single report? Zurich was perfect for such questions. The city lived in the gray, polished, respectable, and conveniently indifferent. Its cafes hummed with conversation in half a dozen languages. At any table you might find a banker, a scientist, or a spy pretending to be either. Letters passed through diplomatic pouches. Files were copied in basements. And beneath the clockwork precision of Swiss civility, men like Dulles built webs of deceit in service of something they called truth. To the OSS, information was oxygen. They hunted it with obsession. German air defense systems, submarine output, radar frequencies, and the production rate of V-weapons. Everything mattered. A misplaced decimal in a report could change the path of a bombing raid. A single intercepted memo could save a convoy in the Atlantic. There was no room for error, no time for hesitation. In the intelligence war, seconds could decide thousands of lives. Stockholm, too, became a sanctuary for spies. The city's neutrality drew exiles, diplomats, and engineers seeking safety from the Reich's tightening grip. In its crowded hotels, OSS operatives met with businessmen who dealt in industrial metals and scientists who carried fragments of forbidden knowledge. A Swedish engineer might share a rumor about a new kind of rocket fuel. A German chemist might whisper about experiments in a laboratory outside Piemont. Nothing was certain, but every fragment mattered. Piece by piece, the Allies began to understand what Germany was building, and what it might unleash. Imagine it, the war raging, cities burning, yet in these quiet northern capitals, the future was being written by men whispering over coffee. How strange that so much of humanity's fate could depend on so few words. How strange that the most powerful weapon of the 20th century was not the bomb, but the report. Alan Dulles understood that. He once wrote that intelligence work is a war of patience. Patience and loneliness. There were nights when he sat alone in his Zurich apartment, the blinds drawn, decoding reports by the dim light of a lamp. He was surrounded by silence, but in that silence he heard the rhythm of an empire cracking. The Germans were proud of their technology, Their rockets, their submarines, their precision, but technology has a trace. Production leaves footprints. Metal shipments, workforce shifts, research papers, factory expansions. The OSS learned to follow those traces like blood on snow. By late 1943, fragments from Stockholm and Zurich painted a picture that was both astonishing and terrifying. The Germans were developing two new weapons unlike anything the world had seen. The first, a pilotless bomb called the V-1, powered by a pulse-jet engine, capable of reaching London within minutes. The second, the V-2, a ballistic missile traveling faster than sound. It could not be intercepted. It could not be stopped. It was a message from the future written in fire. How do you fight an enemy whose weapons you have never seen? You listen harder. You gather what you can, test reports, engineering sketches, the stray boast of a drunken officer, and build your picture from the fragments. And if your picture is right, you save cities. If it's wrong, you condemn them. That was the burden of intelligence. And it fell on the shoulders of men who could never claim victory openly. Among them was a young OSS analyst in Stockholm, known only by the codename Gray. His job was to intercept letters between German firms and Swedish suppliers. Day after day, he sifted through shipping records, searching for patterns. A sudden surge in stainless steel orders, a new alloy that matched descriptions of rocket casings. His office was small, windowless, and cold. But one afternoon he found it, a purchase order for liquid oxygen tanks, routed through a front company. It was confirmation. Germany's rocket program was accelerating. The discovery was quietly cabled to London. No headlines. No fanfare. Just another quiet shift in the balance of power. Information could change everything, and yet, it was invisible. The OSS knew that their greatest victories would never make the news. They were ghosts in a war of giants, fighting with pens instead of bullets. And sometimes, even among themselves, they questioned whether what they were doing was truly enough. Was it courage, or cowardice, to fight a war without ever firing a shot? Switzerland remained the epicenter of that moral tension. Dulles entertained sources in polished hotel rooms, sipping coffee with men whose hands were stained with compromise. He listened to German industrialists who claimed to despise Hitler but continued to profit from his war. He met scientists who spoke of rockets with fascination and guilt. He recorded their words meticulously, knowing that every confession came wrapped in motives he could not fully trust. He was in many ways less a spy than a confessor, a man who absorbed other men's sins in the name of national survival. Outside, the world burned. Inside, Dulles and his agents wove a counter-narrative. They were not warriors. They were interpreters of chaos. Sometimes the information they uncovered was too large to process. Reports of factories churning out nerve agents under code names. Rumors of concentration camp experiments designed to weaponize disease. Most of these claims could not be confirmed, but they haunted the OSS officers nonetheless. If even a fraction was true, then the enemy was not just fighting for domination, it was experimenting with annihilation. And yet, amid that horror, there was a strange serenity to the work. Intelligence demanded discipline. Emotion was a liability. Dulles used to say that panic and haste were the enemies of accuracy. His agents learned to control both. They wrote their reports in calm, detached prose, as though describing weather patterns, even when what they described were factories of death. They had to. To survive in a world built on deception, one had to become comfortable with ambiguity. Neutrality protected them, but only barely. The Gestapo had eyes even here. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, maintained its own networks across Switzerland and Sweden. Meetings could be watched. Couriers could disappear. Trust was rare and often fatal. Every handshake carried risk. Every face might hide betrayal. And yet the work continued because it had to. The truth, however faint, was the only weapon that could pierce the armor of propaganda. If you stood in Zurich in 1944, you might have seen nothing, just a peaceful European city, its trams punctual, its cafes full. But beneath that surface, an invisible war raged. Documents crossed borders under false seals. Scientists fled with stolen blueprints in their shoes. Bankers laundered funds for both sides. Diplomats traded favors for information. It was a theater of masks and everyone wore one. Alan Dulles sat at the center of it, calm and unreadable, his files growing thicker by the week. From these files would come the intelligence that helped the Allies target German rocket sites, adjust bombing strategies, and understand the industrial anatomy of the Reich. But the deeper he went, the more he understood the paradox of intelligence. To know too much is to lose a part of your soul. Information was power, and poison. When the war ended and Europe crawled out of its ruins, Dulles would become the first civilian director of the CIA. But long before that, in those cold years in Switzerland, he learned the cost of omniscience. He learned that truth in the hands of governments can be both salvation and damnation. And he learned that victory in the shadows never feels like triumph, only exhaustion. If you've made it this far, stay with us. The story that follows will take you deeper into this secret war, into the rooms where science, fear, and morality collided. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next chapter reveals how the OSS, armed only with whispers, turned intelligence into strategy, and strategy into survival. Tell me, what would you have done if you held the power to see the enemy's future, but could never reveal your own? In the months that followed, the war in the shadows deepened. The OSS had learned that information was not a stream, it was a labyrinth. Every door opened to 3 more, each marked with uncertainty. In Stockholm, cables carried messages disguised as trade correspondence. In Zurich, couriers slipped envelopes between newspapers, timed to trains that would cross into France or Italy. The Allies were no longer guessing, they were listening. But listening came with echoes, and sometimes the echoes lied. The Germans knew they were being watched. By 1944, counterintelligence became its own form of art within the Reich. The Abwehr planted false leads, exaggerated weapon progress, and used captured scientists to leak half-truths that would misdirect Allied efforts. One document might claim that the V2 program had stalled. Another, that production was accelerating beyond control. The OSS analysts in Switzerland and Sweden worked night after night to reconcile contradictions. They were not just collecting facts, they were fighting against the weaponization of confusion. Alan Dulles called it, the fog within the fog. He understood that the war's outcome might depend not only on what they discovered, but on what they chose to believe. For every verified report, there were 10 that hovered between truth and fabrication. Somewhere inside that noise lay the reality of German power, the rate of U-boat construction, the reach of their radar, the terrifying pace of their rocketry. Dulles's task was to find the rhythm of that truth before the bombs found their mark. Among his most trusted sources was a man known by the codename George Wood. In reality, he was a German economist stationed in Switzerland, outwardly loyal to Berlin, inwardly repulsed by it. Through Wood, Dulles received detailed reports about the state of the German economy, production figures, transportation bottlenecks, resource shortages. The numbers were lifeless on paper, but to Dulles they told a human story. A Reich stretched thin, burning fuel faster than it could refine it, grinding through workers and machines alike. Yet even in collapse, Germany's technological arm remained formidable. The V2 program alone consumed resources equal to an entire army division. In Stockholm, the reports were equally alarming. A group of Swedish engineers sympathetic to the Allies began to smuggle out blueprints, not the weapons themselves but the machinery behind them. Drawings of turbines, jet engines, magnetic triggers for mines. Some of these men never returned home after accidents, on icy roads or fires in isolated workshops. Each time, the OSS recorded their names in silence, folded the pages into new files and moved on. Intelligence work did not allow mourning, only accuracy. What the OSS gradually uncovered was a picture of Germany's final gamble. A technological race that bordered on desperation. Factories buried underground to escape bombings. Scientists ordered to accelerate impossible projects. And hidden among them, the whisper of something that terrified even the ones building it, research into nerve agents and bacterial weapons. By early 1944, Alan Dulles's reports on chemical and biological warfare began circulating among Allied command. They spoke of laboratories outside Breslau and Frankfurt experimenting with new toxins, of gas shells stockpiled but never used. The Allies had their own programs, of course. No nation in this war held clean hands, but the fear was not symmetry. It was escalation. What if Germany, cornered and facing defeat, decided to end the war with something beyond comprehension? Could science, once weaponized, ever be contained again? Dulles wrestled with these questions alone, late at night, his office light the only one burning in the U.S. legation building. Outside, Zurich was peaceful. Inside, the walls were lined with reports describing horrors too large to fit on the page. Sometimes he would stop reading and simply stare at the typewritten words, the calm bureaucratic tone unable to disguise what they implied. How could a civilization so proud of its philosophy and engineering also construct factories for death? He found no answer, only a growing conviction that the human intellect, once surrendered to ideology, could outpace morality. In the field, OSS operatives took on tasks that blurred every line of legality. They intercepted mail, bribed couriers, paid informants who were themselves spies for multiple governments. One agent described his mission as fishing with ghosts. You never knew who would take the bait or what they would drag back with them. Yet out of that chaos, patterns emerged. German supply chains tightened. Metal shipments decreased. And from sources deep within occupied France, confirmation arrived. The V-2 was operational. London had little time. In the summer of 1944, the first V-1 flying bombs began falling over the city. They arrived with a mechanical drone that froze the blood of those who heard it, a sound that cut off just before impact. The British called them buzz bombs. Civilians died by the thousands. Yet, thanks in part to intelligence gathered in Stockholm and Zurich, countermeasures were already underway. Anti-aircraft defenses were repositioned. Radar tracking was refined. For the first time, knowledge moved faster than fear. But then came the V-2, silent, supersonic, unstoppable. It struck without warning, killing from the edge of space. To many it seemed like magic. To the OSS, it was the inevitable result of genius detached from conscience. When reports reached Dulles about the testing sites at Peenemünde and the relocation of engineers to the Harz Mountains, he understood that the war had crossed the threshold. This was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about the inheritance of power. Whoever controlled this technology after the war would shape the next one. That thought lingered like a shadow behind every decision. Was the OSS gathering intelligence only to end the war, or also to prepare for the world that would follow? Dulles did not speak of it openly, but his agents sensed it. The tone of his dispatches changed, less descriptive, more strategic. He was no longer just mapping the German machine. He was anticipating its capture. And in doing so he was already thinking beyond Berlin. One evening, an agent returned from a meeting with a German scientist who had fled to Switzerland. The man brought notes about liquid fuel engines and supersonic propulsion, concepts years ahead of their time. Dulles studied them for hours, fascinated. The scientist wanted asylum in exchange for cooperation. He was granted it. Months later, his ideas would find their way into American laboratories. The war was still raging, but already the seeds of the next age were being planted, quietly, inevitably. Meanwhile, in Stockholm, OSS officers kept watching the factories. Reports confirmed a drop in U-boat production but a corresponding rise in research for smaller, faster subs. The Electroboot, a machine that could stay submerged far longer than anything before it. The war at sea was changing. The Allies were learning to predict it, strike it, adapt to it. But every success came with a question. Who was truly in control? The men collecting the secrets or the secrets themselves? By late 1944, Dulles's Zurich station had become one of the most important intelligence hubs in Europe. He was receiving hundreds of reports a week, raw, unfiltered, and urgent. Some came from anti-Nazi resistance groups, others from industrial insiders. He read them all. His staff called him the listener. He rarely spoke in meetings, preferring to let silence do the work. Those who met him often left unsure whether they'd just been interrogated or absolved. And in that quiet, a transformation occurred. The OSS, once an improvisation of the American war effort, began to resemble something more permanent. Its networks, its methods, its cold efficiency, all the ingredients of what would soon become the Central Intelligence Agency. The seeds of the modern intelligence state were being sown, not in Washington, but in these European rooms where secrets were currency and trust was a myth. Outside, the Reich was collapsing. Inside, the OSS was already preparing for the world after it. Dulles saw it clearly. Power does not vanish with victory, it adapts. The scientist who once built rockets for Hitler would soon be building them for someone else. The maps would change, but the pursuit of knowledge and the manipulation of it would remain eternal. As the war neared its end, Dulles met with a Swiss intermediary representing German officers seeking surrender. They spoke not of guilt, but of preservation, of what knowledge might be spared, what men might be saved, what alliances could be quietly rearranged before the dust settled. History would later call it negotiation. In truth, it was inheritance. The OSS was already curating the future. And yet, through all of this, the loneliness of the work remained. Dulles once told an aide, "The most dangerous thing about intelligence is how much it teaches you about people." He meant it as both warning and confession. To know the world's secrets is to see it without illusion, and to live without comfort. His operatives understood that too. Some drank too much. Some vanished after the war, unable to adjust to daylight. Others stayed, building the invisible empires that would define the Cold War. By the spring of 1945, the OSS knew the end was near. The reports from Sweden and Switzerland became less about discovery and more about transition. German scientists were fleeing westward, carrying with them everything that could be sold to a victor. The Allies were racing to find them first. For Dulles, it was both triumph and melancholy. The War of Shadows had ended, but the Age of Secrets had just begun. He looked out from his Zurich window one final time. The city below was as calm as it had been 2 years before, trams still moving, clocks still ticking. But something in the air had changed. The world had crossed into an era where silence could kill as effectively as a bomb. The cables he sent that night were brief. One line read simply, "Mission complete." Another, "The next war will be born from what we have learned." He wasn't wrong. If you're still here, you've seen the hidden side of World War II, the war that unfolded in neutral cities, fought not with guns but with knowledge. In the next part, we'll step into the aftermath, how the intelligence gathered by the OSS shaped the dawn of the Cold War, and how the same men who spied on Germany began watching the world. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because this is where history turns from victory into vigilance. And ask yourself, when the war ends, what do spies do with the truth they've learned? The war was ending, but the silence did not end with it. In the ashes of Berlin, where cities lay in ruin and victory banners hung like bandages, a new struggle began. One fought not with bombs or bullets, but with memory. The men of the OSS had gathered everything they could from the wreckage: blueprints, scientists, files, formulas, and above all, knowledge. Yet even as the last shots of the war faded, Alan Dulles understood that knowledge had already changed ownership. The question now was not how to defeat Germany, but who would inherit its mind. The Third Reich had built machines of extraordinary sophistication, guided by an obsession with dominance and fear. The Allies, staring into that abyss, realized something chilling. The war had proven not just who had stronger armies, but who had deeper curiosity. The rockets that once fell on London would become the seeds of a future America. The same engines that, in a few short years, would launch mankind into space. It was the ultimate paradox: progress born from horror, enlightenment extracted from atrocity. Dulles, still in Zurich, began coordinating the transfer of German scientists to Allied custody. Some called it Operation Paperclip. Others called it what it was: the quiet repurposing of the enemy's genius. Men who once saluted Hitler now signed contracts in English. Their allegiance shifted from one flag to another, but their ambitions remained the same. They would build again. They always built again. To Dulles, this was both victory and prophecy. The intelligence networks he had woven across neutral Europe did not dissolve with peace. They hardened. The OSS itself would soon transform into the Central Intelligence Agency, an institution that would carry his methods and his doubts into every corner of the globe. The war in the shadows had proven too effective to be abandoned. The world had learned that information was power, and that power never sleeps. But there was something colder beneath that triumph. Those who had spent years peering into deception found it difficult to return to daylight. The OSS officers, once heroes in silence, became men without purpose in peace. They had lived in the margins, built trust on lies, and learned to see the world as a series of secrets waiting to be traded. How could they unlearn that? How could they go back to normal when they had tasted omniscience even for a moment? Alan Dulles didn't go back. He couldn't. In the aftermath of war, he stayed in Europe, quietly shaping the next intelligence order. Zurich became a meeting ground again, not for spies of nations at war but for architects of a new world divided by ideology. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally but an adversary. The Cold War had not yet been declared, but it was already here, in telegrams and in eyes. The same tools that had uncovered German weapons were now being turned toward the east. The enemy had changed, but the method, the patience, the paranoia, remained the same. And so began the era of invisible lines. The Iron Curtain, still metaphorical in those early days, was first traced by men like Dulles, sitting over maps covered in red and blue pins. In neutral countries, Stockholm, Zurich, Vienna, new networks took root. Agents once hunting German secrets now hunted Soviet ones. The machinery of espionage adapted with frightening ease. It was no longer about defeating evil but managing balance. Truth became a commodity traded between democracies and dictatorships alike. But beneath the machinery of states, a more personal war continued, the war inside the minds of those who had seen too much. Dulles often spoke about the moral loneliness of intelligence. He meant that every choice in the shadows came at a cost. Alliances with questionable men, compromises justified as necessary, silence where truth might have healed. He had seen good men corrupted by secrecy and cowards disguised as patriots. And yet he kept going. Because in his world, stopping meant blindness, and blindness was the one sin a spy could never afford. In 1946, when the OSS was formally disbanded, its remnants were quietly absorbed into the new Central Intelligence Group, the embryo of the CIA. The transition was seamless because the philosophy was the same. The OSS had proven that information could win wars. Now it would be used to prevent them. At least that was the promise. But promises are fragile in the dark. What had begun as an act of defense, gathering intelligence to protect freedom, began to evolve into something more ambiguous. The same techniques that had uncovered German weapons were now being applied to allies, politicians, even civilians. Surveillance had become a habit. Curiosity had become control. Dulles returned to Washington, but part of him never left Zurich. He missed the cold precision of that world, the way every word mattered, the way silence had weight. In the capital, politics felt messy, noisy, and shallow by comparison. In Zurich, secrets were sacred. In Washington, they were currency. Still, he adapted. By 1953, Allen Dulles was appointed the first civilian director of the CIA. The man who had once whispered in hotel rooms now commanded an empire of whispers. The shadows he had once served now stretched across continents. And with them came a question that would haunt history for decades. How much power should any one agency, any one man, possess in the name of security? The transformation of intelligence into institution was both inevitable and dangerous. Under Dulles, the CIA became a machine that could reach anywhere, shape governments, erase evidence, and rewrite reality. The lessons learned in neutral Europe, subtlety, manipulation, plausible deniability, became doctrines. Covert action replaced diplomacy. The invisible war had become a permanent condition. And yet, in all his efficiency, Dulles never forgot the essence of what had begun in Zurich, the pursuit of knowledge. He believed that the world's stability depended on knowing what others planned before they acted. It was a conviction both logical and fatal. For in his pursuit of understanding, Dulles would one day find himself accused of creating the very paranoia he once fought against. But that is another story. For now, we return to the men who followed him, the agents who carried the scars of the OSS into the age of ideology. Many of them found themselves stationed again in Europe, this time watching a different kind of enemy. They worked from embassies and listening posts, decoding Soviet cables, studying factory outputs in the East, tracing the migration of scientists from Germany to Russia. The same cities, Stockholm, Zurich, remained crossroads of information. Neutrality once more became both shield and trap. The irony was bitter. The war they had fought to end all wars had birthed an unending one. Where once they gathered intelligence to prevent disaster, now they gathered it to maintain advantage. Morality had no fixed coordinates anymore. The only constant was vigilance. One of Dulles's former operatives wrote years later, "We built an empire of secrets and then became its prisoners." He wasn't exaggerating. The culture of intelligence, once born in the noble urgency of wartime, had become a self-sustaining system. Secrets required protection. Protection required secrecy. And secrecy demanded control. Through it all, Dulles remained calm, patient, deliberate, the same man who had waited in Zurich cafes for whispers that would change the world. He never doubted the necessity of what he did. He doubted only the world's ability to understand it. To him, ignorance was the real danger. But he never asked if too much knowledge could be just as deadly. In retrospect, the OSS work in Sweden and Switzerland was a prelude not just to victory, but to the architecture of modern power. It proved that war could be fought with information, that neutrality was an illusion, and that truth, once weaponized, would never again belong to the public. It belonged to those who could afford to keep it hidden. And yet, the human element, the loneliness, the doubt, never disappeared. In interviews decades later, surviving operatives recalled the same sensation: the sound of ticking clocks, the feel of cold coffee beside coded reports, the awareness that no one outside those rooms would ever know what they had done. They had saved lives, yes. But they had also built a world where secrecy ruled, where truth was always filtered, and where the shadows they once fought became permanent. What would you have done standing in their place? Would you have chosen transparency and risked chaos? Or would you have chosen silence and preserved control? Is there a right answer when every decision exists in the dark? Perhaps that is the final lesson of Alan Dulles' War, that in seeking to understand evil, men sometimes inherit its tools. And in mastering the shadows they risk becoming them. If you're still watching, stay close. Because the next part of this story dives into the consequences, the moral aftermath, the reckoning that came when the victors realized what they had built. Subscribe to follow it through. Because in the end it's not about who won the war, but who learned to live with what they knew. In the years that followed, the shadows deepened again. Victory had not brought light, it had only shifted where the darkness lived. The war was over, but the architecture of secrecy remained, humming quietly beneath the surface of every government that had survived. For Alan Dulles, it was a new kind of battlefield, one without uniforms, without front lines, but with consequences just as devastating. He sat at the head of the CIA, the empire born from the OSS, surrounded by men who had learned the same lesson in Zurich and Stockholm. That power begins with what you know. They had once hunted the secrets of the Reich, now they hunted the whispers of the world. And in the pursuit of knowledge, they found themselves becoming guardians of silence. The early years of the Cold War were a fever dream. Nations rebuilt their cities but buried their hearts under paranoia. The Soviet Union expanded behind its Iron Curtain. The United States built its arsenal in answer. Each side watched the other with the same nervous devotion once reserved for gods. Dulles believed that ignorance was death, that not knowing what your enemy planned was the first step toward losing everything. And so, the machinery of surveillance grew. Quietly. Methodically. Without apology. Every lesson from the neutral countries was applied again. The patience of Switzerland. The observation of Sweden. The art of gathering information from those who think they are safe. Only now the stakes were higher. The world was no longer fighting for land, it was fighting for existence. It was said that Dulles never smiled without calculation. He had become the architect of an invisible empire. A man whose pen could topple governments, whose silence could end lives. Yet he still saw himself as a defender, not a ruler. To him, intelligence was not tyranny but necessity. If truth could prevent war, then perhaps secrecy could preserve peace. But what happens when secrecy becomes the war itself? The CIA began to operate like a mirror of its enemies. Covert operations replaced diplomacy. Assassinations replaced negotiation. Propaganda became policy. And through it all, Dulles remained unshaken, convinced that the end justified the means, that the methods of Zurich were now the moral compass of the world. Yet even for a man who had mastered control, cracks began to show. The same isolation that once kept him focused now began to consume him. He had built a system that no longer needed him to function. The agency had become a self-sustaining organism, a machine that produced secrets simply to justify its own existence. Dulles had created the perfect intelligence service, and in doing so, he had created something that could no longer distinguish between protection and power. By the late 1950s, whispers reached him that his name was spoken with unease in Washington. Too powerful. Too independent. Too willing to act without permission. In public he remained a gentleman, in private he was feared. The same calm that once impressed diplomats now unsettled presidents. Eisenhower trusted him, Kennedy did not. And when the Bay of Pigs failed in 1961, Alan Dulles' long, quiet reign came to an end. The man who once shaped wars from hotel rooms in Zurich was forced into retirement by a younger world that no longer understood the one he had built. But Dulles did not see defeat. He saw confirmation. History, he believed, was cyclical. The public always demanded heroes, then turned against them the moment those heroes revealed how the world actually worked. He had lived long enough to know that secrecy was not evil, it was merely uncomfortable truth. A truth people preferred to forget. In his private journals he wrote about the loneliness of clarity. He compared intelligence work to standing on a mountain. You could see everything but you could never go back down. That was the cost of knowledge, perspective without peace. And yet, beneath his reasoning there was regret. Not for what he had done but for what his creation had become. The intelligent state that rose from his shadow no longer served humanity, it managed it. It no longer listened to whispers, it recorded every breath. Technology had replaced instinct. Algorithms replaced intuition. The world had moved beyond Dulles' imagination, but not beyond his design. If you trace the modern surveillance world back far enough, the satellites, the data centers, the listening programs that map every movement, you end up not in Silicon Valley but in Zurich. In the quiet rooms where the OSS learned to turn observation into domination. Dulles did not invent the desire to know everything, he merely gave it structure. But what of the others? The nameless men and women who had followed him through the war, the ones who gathered intelligence believing they were saving the world? Many of them faded into anonymity. Some retired to farms or small towns, carrying secrets that would never be spoken. Others stayed within the system, watching as their craft became industry. One of them decades later would say in an interview, "We thought we were defending democracy. Maybe we were just teaching it to hide." It's a haunting thought, isn't it? That a nation built on freedom could learn control from its enemies, and call it progress. Alan Dulles spent his final years in a quiet house in Georgetown, surrounded by books and memories that refused to rest. Visitors said he spoke softly, still analyzing, still connecting patterns no one else could see. When asked if he regretted anything, he smiled and said, "Regret is for those who had better options." But sometimes, when the conversation drifted, his eyes grew distant, as if he was still in Zurich, still waiting for a message that would never come. Outside, the world had changed. The rockets he once feared had become spacecraft. The scientists he once protected had become celebrities. And the intelligence networks he once commanded had become invisible, untouchable, beyond scrutiny. It was as though the war of secrets had won not by conquest, but by absorption. The world itself had become a network, and everyone inside it, a potential source. Some historians call this the inevitable price of safety. Others call it the quiet collapse of moral boundaries. Both might be right. But there's a deeper truth beneath it all. One Dulles himself once wrote in a letter never meant for publication, "Knowledge is not power. It is temptation." He had seen it firsthand. The same hunger that drove the OSS to understand German weapons now drove entire nations to watch their own people. Every discovery created a new appetite. Every success demanded another secret. There was no end, only momentum. The moral aftermath of that war was not fought on battlefields. It was fought in silence, in the minds of men who realized too late that their greatest weapon had been curiosity. They had stared too long into the unknown, and the unknown had stared back. For the agents who survived the OSS years, the question that lingered was simple. Had they saved the world or merely postponed its reckoning? The answer depended on who you asked. Some found peace in the idea that their work had shortened the war, saved lives, prevented catastrophe. Others could never shake the sense that something irreversible had been set in motion, that the moral center of civilization had shifted ever so slightly, but permanently, toward secrecy. Perhaps that's the tragedy of intelligence. It begins as protection and ends as obsession. It promises safety but delivers surveillance. It offers truth but demands silence. By the time Alan Dulles died in 1969, the world he helped create had already outgrown him. Satellites orbited the sky he once studied through rumor. Computers processed more data in a second than his entire Zurich team could in a month. The invisible war had become permanent, ambient, and no one even questioned it anymore. People didn't need to be told what to fear, they carried it in their pockets, in their newspapers, in their laws. Still, one image remains. A man standing in a neutral city in a war that claimed to have ended, holding a single piece of paper that contained a secret powerful enough to alter the course of nations. He looks calm, composed, unreadable. But beneath that calm is the oldest human fear, the fear of what happens when you finally know too much. If you've followed this far, you already understand. The true climax of this story is not in the explosion of weapons, but in the quiet moment when knowledge becomes belief, when intelligence becomes faith, and when faith, left unexamined, becomes control. Stay with us for the final chapter, the reflection. Because what began in the frozen streets of Stockholm and the polished rooms of Zurich didn't end with the fall of Germany. It continues today in ways we still fail to recognize. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because the past is not over. It's only waiting to be noticed again. The world today hums with the same quiet tension that once filled Zurich's hotels and Stockholm's cafes. It's different in form but not in spirit. The technology is faster, the networks wider, the stakes invisible, yet the essence remains. A war for knowledge waged in silence. Every time a message is sent, a location tracked, a conversation recorded, the echo of Alan Dulles' Shadow War can still be heard. The battlefield has only changed shape. The soldiers have changed names. But the silence, that precise, measured silence, is still the same. History likes to divide itself neatly, good against evil, victory against defeat. But the truth is messier. The OSS, in its pursuit of intelligence, blurred lines that can never be redrawn. It taught the free world that information was power, and that power required secrecy. In defeating a totalitarian regime, the Allies had learned some of its habits. They did not march under the same banners, but they learned to guard, to monitor, to manipulate, all in the name of security. Is that progress? Or just a quieter kind of control? Perhaps that question has no answer. Perhaps that's the point. In the decades since Dulles' death, the empire he built has become omnipresent. The CIA grew into a global instrument, capable of influence far beyond borders. Its reach extended into politics, economics, even culture. The lessons of Zurich became templates for coups, for propaganda, for the engineering of consent. Nations watched nations, allies spied on allies, and privacy became the first casualty of peace. All justified by the same sentence. To protect the world we must know everything. The logic is seductive, isn't it? To see every threat before it happens. To prevent chaos before it begins. But when does protection become possession? When does safety become surveillance? The world Alan Dulles helped shape never stopped asking, and never stopped avoiding the answer. If you trace the origin of that mindset, the belief that silence keeps us safe, it leads back to those neutral cities during the war. Zurich, where whispers became weapons. Stockholm, where knowledge crossed borders disguised as trade. Those places taught intelligence operatives a simple truth, that the human need to understand is stronger than any moral boundary. Once you've tasted forbidden knowledge, you can never go back. And that hunger has never left us. It's in our machines, our governments, our screens. Every click, every search, every surveillance satellite, they're all descendants of a single idea born in a war fought in silence. The idea that knowing everything is the same as being safe. But Dulles knew better. He learned, too late, that information without wisdom is like a weapon without a conscience. You can aim it, but you can't always control where it lands. Imagine him now, older, sitting alone in his study, the lamplight soft, papers spread like old ghosts. The world outside racing toward the future. A future he helped invent but no longer understood. Perhaps he wondered, as many do now, whether humanity was ever meant to see so much. Whether the pursuit of knowledge, unrestrained, would one day make us blind. He might have remembered Stockholm, 1943, the man walking beneath frozen lamps, carrying secrets heavier than steel. He might have remembered Zurich, the soft hum of conversation, the coded words that turned into weapons. He might have understood, finally, that every war fought in the shadows leaves a residue that never fades. Because history doesn't end. It just changes disguise. The OSS agents who once carried messages across borders were replaced by analysts behind glowing screens. The couriers became satellites. The whispers became data streams. But the essence, the moral tension, the solitude, the sense of watching from the dark, never disappeared. It evolved. The Cold War they built has melted into a digital one, quieter, cleaner, but no less consuming. And perhaps that's what makes this story still matter. Because it's not just about spies or scientists or the intelligence that won a war. It's about us, about how easily we trade privacy for protection, truth for certainty, freedom for fear. It's about the illusion that if we know enough, we'll finally feel safe. We never do. We never will. The ghosts of Zurich still linger in the circuitry of our world. Every intelligence agency that operates today, every secret archive, every classified file, they all trace back to the same idea born under the snow of 1943. That knowledge can be controlled, that truth can be managed. But truth, like war, has a way of escaping its boundaries. And when it does, it reminds us of what we've forgotten, that every secret kept has a cost and every cost leaves a scar. Alan Dulles once said that in the world of intelligence, victory is invisible. Maybe that's why it never feels like victory at all. The OSS had won its war. The Allies had triumphed. But the world they built afterward, the world of shadows and secrecy, is still with us, quietly dictating how nations behave and how people live. The war of silence never ended, it just changed frequency. Look around. The same questions whispered in Zurich 70 years ago still echo today. Who watches? Who decides? And how much truth can a society survive before it begins to fracture under its own reflection? Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: we never stop being at war. We just learn to fight it with information instead of armies. Every piece of data collected, every communication monitored, every algorithm predicting what we'll think next, they're all weapons in a new kind of conflict. One fought not for land but for certainty. And certainty, like power, is never free. Alan Dulles would have understood that. He would have smiled, the kind of smile that hides understanding behind exhaustion. He'd have seen the world we live in and recognized it instantly. Not as a tragedy but as inevitability. The war of secrets had simply outgrown its creators. And yet, perhaps, he would have asked the same question we ask now. What happens when the watchers forget why they began watching? When protection becomes control? When the line between defense and domination dissolves? Would we even notice? Would we care? The answers are no longer hidden in codebooks or locked archives. They're visible, in plain sight, on every glowing screen we hold. The same instruments of observation that once required rooms full of agents now sit in our pockets. We have become our own intelligence service, our own informants, our own witnesses. And like the spies of Stockholm, we, too, live in the uneasy comfort of neutrality, convinced we are safe because we choose not to look too closely. History repeats itself not because we forget but because we adapt. The shadows just change shape. And the war, the real war, never ends. If you've watched until now, you already know this isn't just a story about the past. It's a mirror. The men who gathered information in the frozen streets of Europe believed they were building a safer world. In their own way they succeeded. But in doing so they built a machine that never stops running, a machine powered by fear, curiosity, and the illusion of control. We are all living in its hum. So when you hear about surveillance or secrecy, or the invisible hands that move the world's events, remember where it began, in those neutral cities where silence was both weapon and refuge. Remember that the first spies of the modern age were not monsters, but men chasing certainty in a world gone mad. And remember that every secret kept in the name of safety eventually asks for a price. The silence of Zurich never really ended. It just grew louder. And if you listen closely enough, between the static of the present, you can still hear it. The sound of a world that learned to see everything but forgot how to understand what it saw. So what do we do with that knowledge now? Do we bury it? Do we expose it? Or do we, like Dulles, carry it quietly, pretending that understanding makes us safe when in truth, it only makes us human? If you've followed this far, you're part of that silence now. Stay with it. Question it. And before you leave, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because remembering is the only act of rebellion left in a world that forgets by design. Because some wars never end. They just stop being loud.